Pick that up, sweetheart. That's what Dr. Marcus Hargrove said to the nurse who just refused to defer to his ego. He didn't know she'd walked through Ramadi carrying a rifle and a radio. He had no idea that beneath her navy scrubs lived hands that had performed field surgery under mortar fire. He couldn't have guessed that the woman refiling his charts at 11 p.m. had earned a Navy Cross 20 years ago. They were wrong. All of them. And what happened next didn't just silence the room, it ended careers. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless mechanical prayer above Mercy General's cardiac unit in Portland, that particular hum that lives in hospitals at every hour, 2 a.m. or 2 p.m., it never changes. The sound gets inside your skull. Natalie Hayes had stopped noticing it 3 years ago, which meant she'd stopped being startled by anything else on this floor. Her brown hair pulled tight into a bun that revealed a faint scar along her left temple, a thin line that caught the light wrong if you knew where to look. She didn't wear makeup to cover it. She didn't avoid its reflection in the medication cart. The scar was just geography on her body, territory she'd walked through and survived. She moved through the hallway with the kind of economy of motion that marked her as different from the other nurses. No wasted steps. No fumbling. No nervous energy bleeding off her like heat. When she walked to the destination, and her hands arrived already knowing what they needed to do. The younger nurses noticed this. They watched her the way infantry watches a sniper, quiet respect, the kind that doesn't require words. In the break room, they called her unflappable. In the supply closet, they whispered about her for starts. She could find a vein in a dehydrated methamphetamine user's arm with one attempt, 2 at the maximum. Hand steady as a surgical laser, movements precise as someone following a checklist written in her own muscle memory. Room for 08 sat at the far end of the unit, past the central station where the monitors beeped their individual songs, some slow, some climbing into anxious rates. The chart on the door read John Doe, Army veteran, transferred from VA Medical Center, acute cardiac condition. Natalie had read the actual name from the intake forms. Ahmed Rashid. 28 years old. The VA hadn't updated the room sign yet. He clutched a pair of worn combat boots to his chest like they were the last true thing in the world, boots that had seen better decades, leather cracked and darkened by time and use. His eyes were closed, but his hands gripped those boots with the intensity of someone holding onto the edge of a cliff. Natalie paused in his doorway, her hand against the frame, and something flickered behind her eyes, a tremor that lasted half a second before her jaw tightened and the moment passed. Her hand steadied. Her breathing reset to baseline. Whatever had moved through her did not come back. She knocked twice, soft, and pushed the door open wider. "Mr. Rashid. I'm Natalie. I'll be your nurse this shift." Her voice came out exactly as it always did, level and measured, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She moved to the forestand, checked the line running into his left arm, confirmed the saline rate without touching anything. The chart said he'd been admitted with acute dyspnea and chest pain radiating to his left shoulder. EKG showed nonspecific STT wave changes. Troponin was elevated. Ejection fraction at 35%. The cardiologists were still working through the differential diagnosis. Could be myocarditis. Could be cardiomyopathy. Could be something worse, something that would require intervention beyond pharmaceuticals. Ahmed opened his eyes. Dark eyes. Eyes that had seen something far away and terrible. Natalie had seen those eyes before in mirrors, on other faces, in the windows of military transport planes. "You're in good hands," she said, and meant it with a specificity that would have alarmed anyone listening closely. "Your blood pressure's running a little low, so we're going to keep fluids steady. Pain scale, 1 to 10. 4, he said. His voice was thin. "When I breathe deep, it goes to a 6. Natalie made a note, already calculating, already 5 steps ahead of the current moment. She'd request a repeat troponin in 4 hours. She'd monitor for any worsening dyspnea, any change in his mental status. She'd watch for the subtle shifts in tone that meant his heart was working harder, struggling, reaching for something it couldn't quite grab. Her hands moved on their own as she checked the monitor leads, each movement a sentence in a language only her body spoke. No hesitation. No stumbling. Just precision applied to the small task of keeping a man alive for another shift. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects. Somewhere down the hall, a patient called for a nurse. No answer came. Budget cuts meant the unit was short 2 nurses today, which meant Natalie would cover 18 beds instead of the regulation 12. She'd done 18 before. She'd done worse. At 8:15 a.m., Dr. Marcus Hargrove arrived for rounds, his white coat pristine as surgical gauze, his shoes polished to a mirror finish. The kind of shoes that required a ritual of attention, the kind that announced their wearer had time for rituals. He was tall, handsome in the way that comes from good genetics and better skin care, with teeth that had been professionally whitened and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His voice carried across the unit before he did, a laugh about something one of the residents had said, a laugh that sounded like the clink of expensive glassware. The residents clustered around him like electrons seeking a nucleus. They wanted his approval. They needed it. This was how hierarchies worked, and Hargrove had perfected the architecture. His eyes found Natalie at the medication cart, and something flickered across his face, not anger exactly, but recognition of something he didn't like. Her competence. Her quietness. The way the other nurses looked to her when they needed to know something, the way her hand became the hand they trusted when and 4 failed 3 times already. Hargrove believed in titles. Hargrove believed in hierarchy. Natalie believed in what worked, which was a subtly different faith. She believed in the patient first, the protocol second, and professional ego approximately never. Hayes, Hargrove said, and his tone made the word sound like an insult. You refiled my charts yesterday without authorization. Natalie looked up from the medication dispenser. Her eyes were steady, clear as water. They were in the wrong section. I corrected them. Next time you file anything, you ask. He smiled. His smile looked like a wolf showing its teeth. I prefer my things untouched. Understood, she said, and looked back down at the medication she was drawing up. A 5 milligram dose of metoprolol, for push. She uncapped the needle with one hand, the syringe held steady in the other. The angle was perfect. The depth was precise. Anyone watching closely would have noticed her hands did not shake. Her voice did not hesitate. She accepted his instruction the way water accepts rain, without defense, without debate, simply returning to its own surface and continuing to be what it already was. Hargrove waited for something more. An apology. A promise. Some sign that she understood his superiority. The silence stretched. Natalie drew the medication, turned toward room 404, and was gone. He stood there, smiling into empty space, already deciding he didn't like her. Already planning something to make the hierarchy clear. At 11:53 p.m., Natalie stood at the central station, her eyes on the cardiac monitors, watching the little waves of electricity that represented human hearts at work. Ahmed Rashid's rhythm was stable but labored, the QRS complexes slightly widened, the PR interval extended. Nothing terrible. Nothing yet. But something was happening at the cellular level, some fatigue accumulating in the muscle, some chemical conversation going wrong in the dark. She'd been a nurse for 17 years, but before that, before she learned to smile and defer and call doctors a sir, she'd spent 14 years as a senior chief petty officer in the Naval Special Warfare Command, and in that life she'd learned to read human bodies the way meteorologists read storms. You could see it coming if you knew what to look for. The pressure change. The way the wind shifted. The way the light turned color. She pulled Ahmed's chart and reviewed his troponin from 6 a.m. Elevated. Not falling like it should be. Still climbing. The EKG hadn't changed. The ejection fraction remained depressed. One of the cardiologists, not Hargrove, thank God, had noted a concern about possible acute myocarditis with potential for rapid decompensation. In plain language, this man's heart might be failing, and it might fail quickly. Natalie made a note, her handwriting precise and small, the print of someone trained to write in darkness and in rain. She flagged the chart for the morning team. She checked Ahmed's foresight, clean, no infiltration, patent. She listened to his lungs through the stethoscope, heard the faint crackles at the bases, the water that shouldn't be there starting to accumulate in the alveoli like snow gathering before an avalanche. He was beginning to decompensate. Not yet. But the machinery was already groaning. At 3 a.m., she sat in the break room for 13 minutes, she didn't allow herself more than 15, and drank cold coffee while staring at a photograph taped to the refrigerator, a photo of a team from 2003, 8 people in desert fatigues, all of them squinting at the camera. 5 of them were still alive. The photo was old enough to have faded, the color shifting toward sepia, toward memory. She looked away. By 4 a.m., Ahmed's oxygen saturation had dipped to 91%. His respiratory rate was climbing. His heart rate was climbing. The telemetry strip showed him starting to miss beats, premature ventricular contractions marching across the screen like soldiers looking for a place to rest. Natalie was at his bedside before the monitor alarm finished its first cry. She increased his oxygen to 3 liters nasal cannula, watched the saturation climb to 94%, then 96%. She looked at his face. He was awake now, eyes wide, frightened, his hands still clutching those combat boots like they were the last anchor he had to the world. "Mr. Rashid, stay with me," Natalie said. Her voice had changed. It was still calm, still measured, but something underneath it had hardened into command. "Your heart's working harder than it should. We're going to get you more oxygen, and I'm calling your cardiologist. You're going to be okay." She meant it, but more than that, she meant it with the absolute certainty of someone who had kept people alive through worse. Through mortar fire. Through ambushes. Through the kind of darkness that exists in places where the Geneva Convention was a suggestion. The fear in his eyes calmed slightly. He saw something in her, some quality that had nothing to do with her nursing credential and everything to do with the fact that she was the kind of person who did not fail. The kind of person who did not break. The kind of person who picked you up at 4 a.m. when your heart was failing and did not put you down until you were fixed. Natalie reached for the phone to call the cardiology on-call resident, and that's when she saw it through the room's small window. A man's reflection in the glass, walking away down the corridor, his white coat the color of authority. Dr. Hargrove. The way he was moving suggested he'd been standing outside the room. Listening. Watching. The way his reflection twisted into something that looked like a smile suggested he'd seen her moment of vulnerability when Ahmed was frightened, the small crack in her composure from which something powerful had leaked out. He'd seen her stop being a nurse and start being something else. Something that made the hierarchy she occupied, at the bottom of his hospital's pyramid, look like a lie. The smile on his reflection was the smile of a man deciding something. The smile of a man making a plan. The dial tone hummed in her ear. Tuesday morning at Mercy General started like every other Tuesday. Fluorescent panels hummed above the cafeteria, casting that pale institutional glow that made everyone look slightly anemic. Natalie carried her lunch tray, wilted salad, black coffee, a roll she wouldn't eat, toward the corner table she always claimed, the one near the window where she could see the Portland rain beginning to stutter against the glass. She'd learned long ago that eating alone was safer than eating with colleagues. Less talking. Less remembering. Dr. Marcus Hargrove stood near the beverage station with his 2 senior residents, the ones he'd been grooming as his personal entourage for the last 6 months. They were laughing about something, probably nothing important, probably something at someone else's expense. Natalie had been working at Mercy General for 3 years and had developed a sixth sense for when Hargrove was in a particular kind of mood. This was the mood. The one where he needed an audience and a target. She should have taken a different route. She was halfway past his table when Hargrove stepped backward, his expensive leather shoe positioned precisely where her tray had to go. It wasn't a stumble. It was choreography. His arm came up as if he were catching his balance, and the motion swept her tray sideways with the casual force of a man swatting at something annoying. The plastic clattered to the tile floor. The coffee cup shattered into 3 pieces that skittered across the floor like glass teeth. Salad sprayed in an arc that would have been almost graceful if it hadn't been deliberate. The cafeteria went still. 37 people stopped mid-chew, mid-sip, mid-conversation. Sound didn't disappear, the fluorescent lights continued their electric humming, the rain continued its percussion against the window, but human noise simply ceased. Hargrove looked down at the mess, then up at Natalie, his face arranged in an expression of exaggerated concern. "Oh, sweetheart, how clumsy of me. Pick that up, would you? That's probably more your speed than actual medicine anyway." The laugh came from his residents first, the kind of laugh that was permission for everyone else to join in. A resident named Chen let out a snort. Another one, Torres, actually slapped the table. A nurse from oncology giggled nervously. The sound moved through the room like a contamination, spreading, infecting. Natalie didn't speak. She set down the empty tray she was still holding and knelt, beginning to pick up the pieces of the cup. Her hands moved with the same precision they used when drawing blood or charting vitals or steadying a patient through panic. One piece. Then another. The salad was already greasing the floor, so she grabbed a napkin from a nearby table. She didn't ask, just took it, and began wiping. Her movements were efficient. Practiced. The movement of someone who had long ago learned that humiliation was best answered with silence. But something in her chest was fracturing, and she knew it. She could feel the pressure building behind her sternum like a too-full balloon. 3 years of watching Hargrove dismiss her competence. 3 years of hearing him mispronounce her name deliberately. 3 years of watching him undermine her clinical judgment in front of patients who were terrified and needed certainty, not chaos. She gathered the last piece of broken cup and stood, her eyes still on the floor. A single tear escaped before she could stop it, not a sob, not a sound, just one drop of salt water that traced her cheekbone before she wiped it away with the back of her hand. She didn't break eye contact as she did it. She looked directly at Hargrove while removing the evidence of his cruelty, while standing in front of 37 witnesses, while every nerve in her body screamed to do something she would regret. "Of course, Doctor," she said quietly. Her voice was precisely calibrated, not broken, not angry, just accepting. The voice of someone who knew her place. Hargrove was already turning back to his residence, his attention span for her exhausted. "See you next week, Hayes." Or maybe not. He glanced at Torres and Chen. "I'm putting down $50 she quits by next Tuesday. Anyone want to take that bet?" Chen laughed. "You're on. She seems like the type to stick around and suffer." Torres nodded, raising his coffee cup. "I'll match you. 50 says she doesn't make it past Wednesday." The 3 of them shook hands across the table like they'd just negotiated something important, something that mattered. Natalie disposed of the napkin, the cup pieces, the fragments of her lunch in the trash can near the kitchen door. The cafeteria had already returned to its background noise. The moment was already becoming a story Hargrove would tell later. "Did you hear what he said to her?" "Just a nurse." She went back to work. The afternoon shift brought charts. 34 patient files that needed to be reorganized because Dr. Hargrove had decided the filing system was inefficient, that nurses were incompetent, that someone needed to feel his frustration about insurance denials and hospital politics and whatever else had soured his morning. He appeared at the nurses' station at 2:08 p.m. with Torres and Chen flanking him like bookends, witnessing everything. Hayes. Not her first name. Never her first name. These charts are a disaster. Absolutely unorganized. I need them refiled by end of shift. Correctly this time. I know reading comprehension isn't your strong suit, but the patient ID should match the file number. Shouldn't be too difficult. He dropped the stack, 23 files, bound together with a rubber band that he snapped off so they scattered across the floor like playing cards. Papers fanned across the tile. One file slid under the desk. Another came to rest near her shoe. He was looking at her face as he did it, watching for the crack, the moment where the mast slipped and she became something he could break. "Of course, Doctor," Natalie said, still sitting in her chair, still calm, still measured. Torres whispered something to Chen. Hargrove smiled, that thin smile that suggested he'd already written the ending to this story. Natalie crouched and began gathering them. 1 file. 2 files. 3. The papers were everywhere. Some were out of order. Some were coffee-stained from someone's mourning. All of them needed refiling, and all of them were her responsibility now, added to her charting, to her patient care, to her day that already had 9 hours of exhaustion baked into it. Her hands were steady. That was the terrible thing, her hands did not shake. They never shook. They had held a child's hand while sniper fire punched through concrete. They had applied pressure to wounds that would not stop bleeding. They had performed field procedures in conditions that would make surgeons weep. They would not shake for this man. She rose, files in hand, and looked directly at Hargrove. The doctors were still watching. The nurses were pretending not to watch. The monitor behind her was beeping its steady rhythm, the heartbeat of a patient who would be fine because Natalie would make sure he was fine. Because that's what she did. That's who she was beneath the scrubs and the quiet and the carefully constructed ordinary life she'd built here in Portland. 3 years of trying to be invisible. 3 years of hiding the woman who had once rappelled out of a Chinook helicopter into the Jolin district, the woman who had survived things that would unhinge most people. She let one tear escape. Just one. She wiped it away without looking away from his eyes. "One day you'll need someone like me," she said quietly, her voice like steel wrapped in silk, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "And I hope you remember this moment." The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside. Hargrove blinked. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face, not fear exactly, but uncertainty. The kind of moment when a man realizes he's pushed against something solid and there might actually be consequences. He recovered quickly, laughing, but it sounded forced. "I seriously doubt that, sweetheart," he said, turning away. "You're a nurse." "That's it." But he said it to her back as she walked toward the file room, and his residents didn't laugh quite as hard this time. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that beneath her scrubs, beneath her ordinary life, Natalie was already calculating. Already wondering what would happen when the man in room 408 started failing. Already knowing what she would do about it, regardless of what Dr. Marcus Hargrove had decided she was allowed to do. That night, at 10:19 p.m., the call came. Ahmed Rashid's monitor began alarming during Natalie's evening rounds. She'd been checking on him every hour, not because protocol required it, but because something about him pulled her. The way he watched her when she entered the room. The way his hand gripped those worn combat boots like they were the only real thing in a world of 4 lines and electrodes and machines that beeped. She approached his bed and immediately knew something was wrong. His skin had taken on that dusky, mottled appearance of someone whose oxygen wasn't moving efficiently. His neck veins were distended. His breathing had become shallow, rapid. His heart rate climbed, the monitor showing 142, then 148, then 156, and his blood pressure was dropping, 110 systolic now, the numbers falling like an elevator. "Ahmed," she said, her voice shifting into something else entirely. The voice of someone trained for crisis. "Look at me. I'm here. You're going to be okay." His eyes found hers with that same recognition she didn't understand. "You told me," he whispered. "Ramadi. You said remember. Remember the woman." His words cut off as he gasped. His hand came up, clutching his chest. Cardiac tamponade. She knew it with absolute certainty. The viral infection listed in his chart had likely caused a pericardial effusion. Fluid was accumulating in the sac surrounding his heart, compressing it, choking it. At this rate, he had for minutes before complete cardiac collapse. She pressed the call button. Once. Twice. Then she grabbed the phone at the nurse's station. "I need Dr. Hargrove in room 408. Stat." The night supervisor's voice came back. Dr. Hargrove requested not to be disturbed. Natalie hung up. She called again. This time it went to voicemail. She paged him 3 times. The pages went unanswered. 2 minutes had passed. Ahmed's systolic pressure was now 80. His oxygen saturation was dropping 94, 92, 88. The night nurse, a competent woman named Rodriguez, appeared at her side. "What do you need?" Natalie's voice had transformed into something crystalline and exact. "Get me an 18-gauge spinal needle, an ultrasound cart, and a bottle of betadine. Now." The doctor said. "Get them now or he dies in 4 minutes." Not a request. A command. The voice of someone who had made decisions in worse circumstances with worse equipment in places where dead meant actually dead, not going to the ICU. Move. Rodriguez moved. The evening shift at Mercy General had that particular quality of exhaustion that comes from 12 straight hours of monitoring failing organs and filling out insurance forms. Natalie pushed a med cart down the corridor toward room 408, her scrub still damp from a code blue that hadn't ended the way she'd hoped. The fluorescent lights cast everything in a flat, colorless glow. She checked her watch, 8:24 p.m. Rodriguez had flagged Ahmed Rashid's vitals an hour ago, blood pressure trending down, breathing shallow, the kind of slow deterioration that usually meant the heart was making up its mind to stop. She'd watched it happen 100 times in 3 years at Mercy General. She'd watched it happen 1,000 times in Ramadi. When she stepped into room 408, Ahmed was sitting upright against 3 pillows, struggling with each breath like the air had become too thick to swallow. His dark eyes tracked her as she entered, and she saw something flicker there, recognition, maybe, or the desperate hope that comes from knowing you're running out of time. The monitors beside his bed beeped their steady rhythm. Oxygen saturation at 91%. Heart rate at 112. His chart lay on the bedside table beside the worn combat boots he'd been clutching when he arrived, their leather cracked and faded to the color of old rust. "How long?" she asked quietly, her hands already moving to check his full line. "Since dinner," he said, his voice rough. "Getting harder to breathe. Chest feels tight. Like there's something sitting on my lungs." She didn't answer yet. She was looking at his face. At the structure of his cheekbones, the particular shape of his jaw, the way his dark eyes held a kind of patient suffering that she'd seen in exactly one place before. 20 years ago. In Ramadi, in a 6-year-old boy who'd been crouching behind a wall when the snipers started firing. She'd shielded him with her own body, kept him there for 18 minutes while rounds punched through concrete and dust bloomed into the air like smoke. His name then had been Ahmed, too. Just Ahmed. She'd never known his family name. "What's your full name?" she asked, pulling up his chart on the tablet. "Ahmed Rashid," he said. "Joined the army 5 years ago. Wanted to come back here, to the States. Wanted to find." He trailed off, breathless. "Medical discharge 2 months ago. Heart started failing. Doctors don't know why. They think maybe shrapnel. Something embedded." Natalie's hands went very still. She didn't look at him. She looked at the monitor and the blood pressure readout and the oxygen saturation number that was dropping like a stone. Ahmed Rashid. She did the math. Born maybe 2004, 2005. That would make him roughly 28, 29. The boy from Ramadi would be exactly that age. "I'm going to need you to stay calm," she said, her voice level. "And I need to listen to your heart." She placed the stethoscope against his chest and heard what she already knew she would hear, the muffled sound of fluid where there should have been open air. Pericardial effusion. The heart drowning inside its own sac. She'd heard this sound before, too. In the field hospital at FOB Dwyer. Under artillery fire. In the dark. At 2:17 a.m., Ahmed's monitor alarm screamed. Not the soft beep of a minor change but the full shriek of the heart going into shock, dropping from 95 beats to 58 in the space of a breath. His eyes went wide. His hands clawed at the sheets. Natalie was already moving. She was already 3 steps ahead of where the moment was. Her brain had shifted into a different gear, the one that didn't think in civilian time, that processed information the way a tactical computer processed threats. She hit the call button and didn't wait for Rodriguez. She was already pulling on sterile gloves. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath," she said to Rodriguez when the nurse appeared in the doorway. 18mm needle. And the ultrasound machine. "Now." "Dr. Hargrove," Rodriguez began, "is unavailable. I'm doing a pericardiocentesis." She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for the hierarchy to confirm. The words came out as simple fact, the way orders had come out for 12 years when she wore the uniform that made it legal. Rodriguez ran. Natalie positioned Ahmed at 30 degrees, her hand steady as surgical steel. She cleaned the subxiphoid area with betadine, the smell of it sharp and iodine dark, flooding her back through the years to operating tents and fluorescent work lights rigged on generators. The ultrasound machine arrived. She found his heart on the screen, the beating chamber surrounded by a black halo of fluid. The fluid that was drowning him. "You're going to feel pressure," she said. Not reassurance. Just data. Not pain. Pressure. "And you're going to keep breathing for me. Can you do that?" Ahmed nodded, his jaw clenched. His oxygen saturation read 84% and falling. 79. 71. Her hands moved with the terrible precision of someone who'd done this under mortar fire, who'd threaded needles while the world exploded. The needle advanced through skin, through fascia, through the pericardial membrane, and then the give. The sudden release that meant she'd found the space. Blood-tinged fluid flooded the syringe. 68. 72. 81. 89. The syringe filled. She advanced another millimeter. More fluid. Ahmed's chest expanded. His breathing eased. The monitor numbers climbed like a plane finding altitude. 96. 98. She secured a temporary drain, her fingers placing sutures with the muscle memory of someone who'd done field surgery in the dark. The whole procedure took for minutes and 30 seconds. The entire time, Rodriguez stood in the doorway with her mouth open. "Where did you learn to do that?" Rodriguez whispered. Natalie didn't answer. She was checking Ahmed's pupils, listening to his lungs, watching the monitor settle into a steady rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Strong. Stable. Ahmed's eyes opened. His hand reached out and found her wrist. His grip was weak but deliberate. "Senior Chief," he said. His voice was different now. Clearer. "I knew it was you. Your voice never changed. In all these years, I've heard it in my head. And I knew." Natalie looked at him. 20 years collapsed like accordion folds. The boy was in this man's face, in the shape of his eyes, in the particular way he held her gaze. The boy who'd been 6 years old when she'd shielded him from sniper fire in the Jolan district, who'd cried her name when the shooting finally stopped, whose face she'd tried for 2 decades not to think about because thinking about him meant thinking about all the other ones she hadn't been able to save. "You joined the army," she said. He nodded, tears tracking down his temples. "To find you. To say thank you. These boots," his eyes moved to the bedside table where the worn combat boot sat like an artifact from another life. "I carried them from Ramadi. All these years. For the woman who saved me. I never thought." He swallowed. "But when I heard your voice, I knew. I knew it had to be you." Natalie turned away. She turned away because her composure had a limit, and she'd just found it. Her shoulders shook once. One breath. Then she pressed her hand against her mouth and forced herself back. The mask went back down. The professional went back on. But for one moment, in the dark of room 408 with the monitors steady and the man she'd saved alive and breathing, the wall she'd built for 20 years cracked right down the center. By morning, Dr. Hargrove had been briefed. The night resident had filed a report. An unauthorized procedure. Protocol violation. Instead of gratitude, instead of acknowledgement of a life saved, Hargrove saw only threat. She'd done what he couldn't do. She'd proven herself under pressure. She'd made him look like he wasn't necessary. The anger in him was cold and calculated. He sat in his office at 7:43 a.m. and made the first call. Dr. Patricia Chen picked up on the second ring. She'd been a board member for 3 years. She owed Hargrove a favor. He'd written a letter of recommendation for her daughter's medical school application. "We have a liability issue," Hargrove said without preamble. "One of the nurses performed an emergency procedure last night without attending physician authorization. Pericardiocentesis. I need the board to know about this. We need to explore whether her credentials are what she claims." By noon, an outside investigator had been assigned. By 2 o'clock, calls were being made to 3 of Natalie's listed references from her job applications, people who'd known her in civilian life, who knew nothing of 12 years of service, who would only confirm what Hargrove was already implying, that there were gaps in her background, unaccounted time, professional credentials that didn't quite add up. Natalie received the summons to HR at 3:15 p.m. The HR director, a woman named Margaret Chen who'd always been pleasant in passing, was deeply uncomfortable. She didn't make eye contact as she gestured to a chair. "We're going to need to discuss your medical training background," Margaret said. "An investigator has been retained to review your personnel file. There are some questions about the scope of procedures you're authorized to perform." Natalie sat in the chair across from her. She'd performed emergency medical procedures on every continent except Antarctica. She'd trained for 12 years in the discipline of saving lives under conditions where there was no margin for error. She'd done it all legally, all officially, all while wearing a uniform that no longer existed in her civilian paperwork. "I performed an emergency procedure on a patient in acute cardiac distress," Natalie said. Her voice was level. "The patient would have died without it. He survived. His vitals are stable. There's no liability." "That's not the point," Margaret said quietly. "The point is authorization. Protocol. You performed a procedure that requires physician oversight." "The attending physician was unavailable," Natalie said. She didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. "The patient was coding. I made a clinical decision." "Based on what training?" "We need to verify." Natalie already knew where this was going. She'd walked away from the military without forwarding addresses, without keeping in touch with anyone who could testify to what she actually was. Her medical training was classified. Her certifications had been part of a sealed personnel file that no civilian hospital had access to. She'd made herself invisible on purpose, and now that invisibility was a cage. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Ahmed Rashid lay 3 floors above them, finally sleeping, finally breathing easily, and in exactly 2 days, she would walk out of Mercy General with a termination letter and Ahmed would be left alone in a hospital where nobody else would know that he needed someone who understood what it meant to survive the unsurvivable. By morning, the machinery of institutional power moved with precision. 3 phone calls went out from Dr. Hargrove's office before 8 a.m., the kind of calls that don't leave written records, just subtle poison in the water supply. He reached board members he'd cultivated for exactly this moment, neurosurgeon Donald Pierce, who owed him a favor from the malpractice settlement he'd helped bury, hospital administrator James Crane, who understood that protecting the hierarchy meant protecting each other, and chief nursing officer Margaret Chen, who'd learned long ago that questioning doctors was career-limiting. The message was identical in each call, wrapped in professional concern, an unauthorized emergency procedure, questionable clinical judgment, a nurse operating outside her scope. Nobody said fraud. Nobody needed to. Implication was the weapon. By 10 a.m., an outside investigator had arrived, a contracted credential auditor named Harold Sykes, the kind of man whose job was to confirm what powerful people already believed. He moved through Mercy General like a disease vector, requesting Natalie's personnel file, her licensing records, her continuing education documentation. He interviewed 3 nurses who worked her shifts, 2 of whom mentioned she sometimes stayed late without logging overtime, which somehow sounded suspicious when filtered through his questions. The 3rd nurse, Jennifer, who actually respected her, said nothing, understood that speaking up meant becoming a target too. Hargrove's network had teeth. He contacted Natalie's previous references systematically, the charge nurse at Naval Hospital Bremerton where she'd worked before retiring from active duty, the chief medical officer at a clinic in Tacoma where she'd done temporary work 2 years ago, the director of a community health program in Seattle. The calls were brief, professional, and deliberately vague. "We're conducting a standard credentialing review on one of our nurses, Natalie Hayes. Just wanted to verify her clinical performance during her time with you. Any concerns? Any incidents?" The pauses after those questions did more damage than accusations. Silence itself became evidence. Nobody said she was incompetent. But nobody rushed to defend her either. By Wednesday morning, an atmosphere had crystallized at Mercy General, the kind that spreads like hydrogen sulfide through a closed space, colorless and poisonous. Staff who'd worked beside Natalie for 3 years suddenly found reasons to avoid her in the break room. The charge nurse, Rita, stopped assigning her to patients she'd previously trusted her with. When Natalie protested the sudden restriction to the geriatric ward, 18 post-stroke patients with minimal acuity, Rita's voice became professionally distant. "Dr. Hargrove has expressed concerns about your clinical boundaries. Until the review is complete, we need to ensure patient safety." The words landed like accusations despite being technically neutral. Nobody said what she'd done wrong. The mystery was the punishment. Ahmed, still recovering 3 floors up, asked for her repeatedly. The nurses told him she was reassigned. He understood without being told that this was retaliation, and his heart rate spiked each time he realized she was being destroyed because she'd saved his life. On Wednesday evening, Dr. Hargrove visited Ahmed's room personally, a rare gesture, calculated and deliberate. He pulled a chair close, voice smooth as oil. "I wanted to explain why Nurse Hayes won't be caring for you anymore. She performed a procedure without proper authorization, and while her instincts were good, hospital policy exists for patient protection. Our credentialing committee is reviewing her background. She's no longer assigned to your care." Ahmed's eyes filled, but Hargrove was already standing, leaving behind a seed of doubt, just enough to make Ahmed question whether Natalie had actually done something wrong. The termination letter arrived Thursday at 2:37 p.m. Natalie knew the exact time because she read it 4 times, looking for something specific enough to fight. The language was precise and sterile. "Following completion of our credentialing review, we have determined that your unauthorized emergency procedure, failure to follow chain of command protocols, and concerns raised regarding clinical judgment are inconsistent with Mercy General's standards of care. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. Your hospital credentials are revoked." Nothing about saving a man's life. Nothing about the procedure being medically sound. Just the absence of authorization, which had nothing to do with whether the procedure was necessary and everything to do with whether it threatened the hierarchy. Security escorted her to her locker, a ritual humiliation she'd seen happen to others, never believing it would happen to her. She moved mechanically, pulling out a cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters, a succulent that had turned brown at the edges because she kept forgetting to water it in the chaos of 12-hour shifts, and a photograph in a small plastic frame. The photo was older, 20 years old, taken in Ramadi before everything went grey. Her SEAL team in tactical gear, 5 men in a row, arms across each other's shoulders. 2 of them were dead now. 1 paralyzed. 1 struggling with TBI and insomnia. She stared at the faces, feeling the weight of time and loss and the fact that she'd tried so hard to leave that part of herself in the sand. The cardboard box felt light in her hands as she walked to the 3rd floor. Room 408. Ahmed was sitting up now, eyes following her immediately. When he saw the box, he understood everything without explanation, understood that the system had turned on her the way it always does on people who violate the chain of command, even to save lives. His face crumpled, and he reached for the worn combat boots sitting on his nightstand, the ones he'd been clutching since admission. "Senior Chief, please." I carried these for you. I carried them through 3 years of ranger school. I carried them through 2 deployments. I carried them because you told me," his voice broke. "You told me to remember the woman who saved me." Natalie set the box down carefully. She was trained to compartmentalize pain, to lock feelings in rooms and walk away from the doors, but standing in that hospital room with Ahmed, something cracked in her careful architecture. Not visibly. Her face remained composed. But inside, something fractured like old concrete. She tried to refuse the boots. "Ahmed, you keep those. You earned them." "No." His hands shook as he pressed the boots into her arms. "Senior Chief, I never forgot your voice. Not once. In Ramadi, you said, 'Stay close, small one. Stay close and stay brave.' And I did. I remembered. Every day of my life, I remembered the woman who saved me." His tears fell freely, and Natalie held the boots, old leather creased and worn and carrying the weight of 20 years of searching. "I never forgot your voice, Chief. I never forgot." The rain hit Portland like a judgment at 4:19 p.m., the kind of cold November rain that soaked through jackets in minutes and made the world go soft at the edges. Natalie stood at a bus stop on Burnside Street, the cardboard box balanced against her hip because her hands were holding the worn boots. She stared at the boots, at the rain bleeding the ink from the termination letter, at the glass shelter that offered no real protection. A bus passed without stopping. She hadn't signaled for it. The rain intensified, and she wondered if disappearing had been worth it, if walking away from Special Warfare Command, if choosing to heal instead of serve, if living quietly and becoming invisible, if all of that had been worth the cost of standing in the rain now, unemployed and alone and carrying a dead veteran's shoes. The fluorescent lights of the bus shelter hummed with that particular frequency that only hospitals and transit stations seem to achieve, a sound she'd learned to filter out years ago. Now it was all she could hear besides the rain hammering the plastic roof. She was still standing there, motionless, when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something made her. The diesel engines rumbled against the concrete like war drums. Friday noon, the emergency bay of Mercy General erupted in a sound that turned heads 3 blocks away. 3 hums pulled in first, their tires still smoking from the interstate. Then the black SUV. Doors opened in perfect synchronization. Boots hit the pavement. Nobody moved inside the ER. The nurses at Station 3 stopped charting. A resident dropped his coffee cup. The sound of it shattering on tile was nothing compared to what came next. 2 Navy SEALs in dress uniforms, dress blues so sharp they looked like they could cut, walked through the automatic doors. Their uniforms moved like water around muscle. Their boots struck the floor with the precision of metronomes. The fluorescent lights seemed to dim in their presence, or maybe that was just how the air pressure changed when operators moved through a room. They didn't walk to reception. They walked to administration. Dr. Marcus Hargrove was sitting in his office, reviewing discharge paperwork. He'd been smiling about something, the termination letter, probably, the one he'd orchestrated 2 days ago. The one that made Natalie Hayes disappear. He didn't hear the footsteps coming. He wouldn't have recognized them if he had. The door opened without a knock. "We're looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes." It wasn't a question. It was a command wrapped in 5 words. The SEAL on the left, the one with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, repeated it. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes." "Where is she?" Hargrove's face went the color of old bone. One of the office staff had to call upstairs. Natalie was in the break room, holding a cold cup of coffee she'd poured 3 hours ago and forgotten. She moved like someone waking from a dream. Down the corridor. Down the stairs. Into the administrator's office where 2 Navy SEALs stood waiting for her like they'd been waiting their whole careers for this moment. The room didn't go silent. The room couldn't silence itself loud enough. Natalie recognized them before they recognized her, the way they stood, the way they breathed, the way their eyes had that 1,000-yard focus of men who'd done things regular people can't imagine. She walked forward. She didn't walk like a nurse anymore. She walked like a senior chief. "I'm here," she said. The SEAL with the scar nodded once. "We need to move. There's a patient upstairs you need to see first." They brought her to room 408. Ahmed Rashid was sitting upright in his hospital bed. The cardiac monitors had been quiet for 2 days now, steady rhythm, perfect O2 sat, his body healing the way bodies heal when someone who knows what they're doing saves your life at 2:17 in the morning. He was crying. The tears ran down his face like rain on a window, and he didn't wipe them away. "Chief," he said. His voice cracked on that single word. He was looking at her like she was resurrection itself. "It's me," he said. "Ahmed. From Ramadi. I was 8 years old. You shielded me from the sniper fire. You covered my ears. You told me to remember you, and Senior Chief, I never forgot your voice. Not for one day. Not for 20 years. I've been looking for you since I turned 18. I knew you were a nurse. I knew you were in Portland. I came to this hospital just hoping." His voice broke. "I came hoping." Natalie looked at him. Really looked at him. And somewhere in his face, the shape of his eyes, the way he held his shoulders, she saw an 8-year-old boy clutching her tactical vest while rounds snapped overhead like thunder. He was that boy. He'd become a soldier because of what she'd done. He'd joined the army looking for the woman who saved him. She was still processing when the SEAL commander entered the room holding a folder. The folder was thick. The paper inside was stamped declassified in red letters. He handed it to Natalie. "Senior Chief, you need to see this." She opened it. 3 tours. Dates. Operations she'd buried so deep in her mind they'd calcified into something that felt like someone else's memory. Ramadi, 2005. The Sunny Triangle, 2006. Kandahar, 2007. Each operation redacted in places, each documented in others with clinical precision. Names of soldiers she'd saved. Counts. 17. The folder said she'd saved 17 lives. The SEAL commander's voice was steady as a surgical laser. Senior Chief Natalie Hayes received 2 Bronze Stars for valor under fire. He paused. The weight of those words sat between them. A Purple Heart for wounds sustained in the line of duty. Another pause. Ahmed was watching her face. The entire room was holding its breath. And the Navy Cross. For extraordinary heroism. In Ramadi. Saving that child. Saving 16 others. Holding your unit together after IED strikes killed 2 of your brothers. Hargrove was still in the office. He was pale the way men get pale when they realize they've miscalculated something fundamental about the world. An FBI agent had appeared. The agent had that particular calm that federal investigators carry, the calm of people who've already done their homework and are simply waiting for you to understand the scope of your problem. "Dr. Marcus Hargrove," the agent said. "We're here regarding forged military service records and falsified federal employment documents. The handcuffs were stainless steel, the kind that caught the light. Specifically, documents you created and submitted claiming Special Forces service, which you used to justify your termination of Senior Chief Officer Hayes. We've also identified 2 prior incidents of credential fraud on your resume submissions, as well as discrepancies in surgical outcome reporting for malpractice cases filed in 2019 and 2021. Hargrove tried to speak. No words came. The agent continued. "You're under arrest for federal document forgery and conspiracy to defraud the Department of Defense. You have the right to remain silent." The perp walk happened at 12:06 p.m. on a Friday. Hargrove in handcuffs, Federal Bureau of Investigation agents on either side, walking through the hallways of Mercy General where nurses he'd belittled for 7 years watched him pass. Residents who'd laughed at his jokes. Staff who'd feared his temper. Someone's phone was recording. By 6 p.m., it was viral. By Sunday morning, the comments section had 15,000 entries. By Monday, the Oregon Medical Board had launched an emergency revocation hearing. Natalie didn't watch any of it happen. She was in a secure office with the SEAL team, looking at the folder again. Ahmed was there too, no longer in the hospital bed but standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder like he'd been waiting 20 years to touch her and couldn't believe she was solid. The team leader, call sign Breaker, though his real name was Clayton, explained what came next. We have a hostage extraction operation in Beirut. American contractors. High risk. We need medical capability. We need someone who's done this before. We need you, Senior Chief. Natalie looked at him. Then at Ahmed. Then back at Clayton. The world had fractured 2 days ago when she'd picked up that termination letter in the rain. Now it was reassembling itself into something that looked like possibility. I'm in, she said. 6 months later, the Portland strip mall looked exactly like every other strip mall in America, fluorescent reality and broken dreams in one rectangular building. A nail salon. A vape shop. An insurance office with a folding table in the window. The table held color-printed brochures and a man in a short-sleeved shirt who no longer had the bearing of authority. Dr. Marcus Hargrove had lost his medical license. The plea deal had cost him 5 years probation and permanent career suspension. The insurance supervisor was 23 years old and had never heard of him before he applied for the job. Natalie Hayes walked past that window on a Friday morning in October, and her eyes met his for exactly 1 second. She didn't stop. She didn't smile. She just nodded, acknowledgement of a man who'd tried to break her and discovered he was breaking himself instead. Hargrove looked away first. His hands trembled as he straightened his brochures. She continued to the airport. PDX loomed ahead with its soaring timber and its promise of sky. The worn combat boots were in her carry-on, wrapped in cloth the way sacred things are wrapped. She was heading to San Diego, Naval Special Warfare Command, Medical Training Division. She'd be teaching young SEALs field medicine. Not full active duty. Service on her own terms. The kind of choice she'd never had before. Ahmed was waiting at the gate. He wore a Portland State ID lanyard and carried a nursing school acceptance letter in his pocket. He'd spent the last 4 months preparing, running prerequisites, getting his prerequisites done. He wanted to save people the way Natalie had saved him. He wanted to be the thing that stood between chaos and mercy. They didn't hug until they were past security. At the departure board, a news segment played on the monitors. Local nurse revealed as Navy SEAL inspires thousands. Natalie didn't watch it. She sat down and pulled out the photograph, her team in Ramadi, faces frozen in time, 8 soldiers standing in front of a concrete wall. Half of them were gone. Half of them had come home. She traced her fingers across their faces, then carefully placed the photograph in the pocket of her travel bag next to the boots. The airplane pushed back from the gate. Portland fell away beneath the wheels. The rain-soaked parking lot where she'd stood with a cardboard box disappeared. Mercy General became a small square visible for a moment, then lost in clouds. Natalie Hayes looked out the window at the sky ahead, at the future that had been waiting for her all along, invisible and patient and absolutely inevitable. In the seat beside her, Ahmed slept with his head against the window. Across the aisle, a passenger was reading about the decorated officer who'd been hiding in plain sight. That officer was her. That woman who'd chosen scrubs as her armor and quiet as her language. That woman who'd never needed recognition to do what was right. The plane climbed higher. The clouds parted. Sunlight flooded the cabin like grace. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. Subscribe to find out what happens next. Like this video if Natalie's story moved you. Comment below, what would you have done in her position?